Gospel. Today's Gospel reading comes from Matthew 5, verses 1 through 12. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches about the blessedness. Seeing the crowds, Jesus went up on the mountain and sat down, and the disciples came to him. And Jesus opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the realm of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the realm of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. May God add understanding to this reading of the Gospel.
Amen. Would you join me in singing the glory of the words are in the book? Glory be to the Maker, and to the Christ, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Amen. Please be seated.
Almighty God, I ask that you anoint my heart and anoint my lips. Touch my lips of clay. Remove me from fears, concerns, and anxieties, and replace that with the movement of your Holy Spirit within me. And anoint the ears of those who would hear a message, that no matter what message they hear today, will be the one that they need for their faith journey. Amen. Roy asked me yesterday if I had a title for my sermon today. It was one of those days where I didn't want to have a commitment. I think if I was to pick a title for today, it is Choose Your Legacy. Our readings for today are so rich and full of great direction for each of us. The gospel lesson of the Sermon on the Mount has a great roadmap of our journey, for our journey, as we walk in unity with Christ. But this morning I want to focus my time on the reading from the Book of Micah. I think that it has an important message for us this weekend as we remember the life of Martin Luther King Jr. It also is a powerful reminder of what we need to be thinking of as our nation goes through the current situation that we are facing. I've read many articles and passages this past week regarding the Micah reading and found some interesting things that I would like to share with you this morning. It talks to us about what will be pleasing to God. Is it the amount of rams or the burnt offerings, the rivers of oil that we bring before the altar? I think it tells us we have much more to think about than just that. One of the messages I read this week was about what is worship. Worship is not designed for what people, members and non-members of the church, want, but it is what our broken, lost, lonesome, anxious, trapped, or victimized lives need. worship as well as our lives should be shaped by mission purpose rather than by aesthetic task or personal preference. Worship is a way of life, a way of living. We must approach worship with a holistic approach, viewing all aspects of our lives as worship. Worship is not just a Sunday gathering time for 11 a.m. Worship should be any time we gather our hearts with ourselves and with others in our lives. The reading tells us to love tenderly, act justly, and walk humbly with our God. To do justice is not getting even or making others pay for what they have done or what they do. According to the Hebrew Scriptures, it states that to do justice is the restoration of balance, the righting of relationships, the anticipation of fairness for all things. To love kindness. That can be messy at times. We want it to be, though, and we need it in our lives. But it doesn't have to be as messy as we want to make it out to be. Even the simplest acts of kindness are as valuable and important as the things that we accept as great acts of kindness. A young child picking a flower out of the garden and taking it to the elderly neighbor. What a beautiful and powerful act of kindness. It's also a very powerful form of worship. Perhaps that little child had a feeling that one particular day that that elderly person just needed one act of kindness to make it through a rough day. The thing that I think is important to remember about kindness is not the significance of the act, but the love of mercy. And then to walk humbly with our God can seem difficult to grasp for us today, especially in our current climate that we live in. To walk humbly with our God is simply to walk in absolute communion with God. Be in communion with God when you open the door for a stranger. Be in communion with God when you offer a smile to the person standing on the street corner with their sign asking for help. Be in communion with God when you interact with anyone in your life. But most importantly, for us to remember today is to be in communion with God when you interact with yourself. We tend to forget ourselves in our worship of God. This reading from Micah, for me, is so important on this day of remembering Martin Luther King Jr. There are so many beautiful quotes that we can attribute to Martin Luther King. We all remember and embrace his acts of civil rights and trying his best to make life better and more tolerant place for all of us. We can recall his life of wanting justice for all. Some people can even stand before you and recite some of his most powerful speeches. Don't expect that from me. But in reading a history of Martin Luther King Jr., I find that one thing we tend to forget is that Martin did not want to be remembered as a great civil rights leader or a great orator for the masses. He did not want to be remembered for being gunned down at the Lorraine Motel. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted one thing. He wanted his legacy to be remembered as a pastor. He wanted people to remember that he had the heart of a pastor. He wanted people to remember that he was concerned with feeding the poor. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted simply to be remembered as a man of God, walking in communion with that God in all the actions he took in his life. He wasn't a perfect person. I hate to break that to you. He had faults, sins, shortcomings. Sounds kind of like some of us, doesn't it? But he knew how to be in communion with God. And that's the legacy he really wanted to leave. The monument that I see on TV that's in Washington, D.C. is an absolute beautiful monument. But his true legacy, the monument that we should see, is his heart beating in time and unison with the heart of God. His legacy of being a pastor. For me, that pretty much sums up today. For us just to live, love tenderly, act justly, and walk humbly with our God.